Merci beaucoup. Je suis très contente de regarder une salle pleine. Et maintenant, même si j'ai déménagé de Vancouver à Ottawa il y a 12 ans, même si il y avait 5 semaines à Jonquière entre les deux villes, I'm going to switch to English now. Because it will be much less painful for all of us. I'm twice as intelligent in English as I am in French, and given the level of education and intelligence in the room, I'm kind of attached to putting my best face forward. 10 years ago, my husband, David, and I were walking across the parking lot of St. Patrick's Basilica in Montreal, and a television crew approached us and said, "The Pope has just died. Would you care to comment?" And I said, "No, I don't think so," and kept walking. And from behind me, David, who hadn't been to church in 40 years, said, "Sure, I'll comment." Yeah, you're allowed to laugh. I turned around stunned, wondering what pearls of wisdom were going to drop from his beautiful mouth. And I watched him bow his head and solemnly declare, "It's a very sad day for Catholics everywhere." And that made the national news. And as we continued on our walk to the old port of Montreal, I turned to him and said, "Hun, that was kind of obvious, wasn't it? And wouldn't it be nice if the next Pope were to come up with a progressive policy on contraception that wouldn't disenfranchise millions of impoverished Catholic women around the world who are trapped in a cycle of childbearing?" And he said, "Yeah, Shari, it would have been nice. Too bad you turned down the interview." And the painful thing was that I knew better. For 10 years in the 1990s, I had been the president of Media Watch, now called Media Action, and we had done all sorts of research looking at the underrepresentation of women's voices in the media. And I had been giving interviews myself for more than 25 years as a spokesperson, as an author, as somebody who knew and wrote in the media. In fact, I had been giving interviews since my underemployed days as a graduate student at Simon Fraser University, before I knew enough to know I didn't know very much. 5 years ago, we launched Informed Opinions as a project of Media Action, as an initiative to bridge the gender gap in public discourse. Because even in 2010, when we did benchmark research, what we discovered was that in the commentary pages of newspapers, which are very influential in terms of setting the agenda, influencing politicians and decision makers, only 20% of those op-eds were written by women. And on influential talk, radio, and television programs as well, women's voices were also outnumbered by men's by about 4 or 5 to 1. Now, it's true that, of course, there are more male CEOs, more MPs, more ministers of the Crown. The decisions they make have a bigger impact on all of us than those at a lower level. But what we found in our research was that even in stories in the 1990s that were about healthcare or education, where women do in fact dominate in some sectors, women's voices were much less present. And one of the reasons for that is that it turns out women turn down opportunities to speak much more often than their male counterparts. My husband is not such an outlier. But that's a problem. And in fact, SSHRC-funded research is documenting one of the problems of the underrepresentation of women, albeit in finance as opposed to media. Do you remember back during the global financial crisis when then Finance Minister of France, Christine Lagarde, was in an interview and she quipped, "If only Lehman Brothers had had a few sisters, we might not be in this mess"? SSHRC is actually funding research that's exploring the Lehman Sisters hypothesis, and early evidence suggests that yes, in fact, if there were more women in finance, we would have a more stable economic market worldwide. Let me give you another concrete example of the absence of women's voice and what difference it makes in the media context. I used to write a column for the Vancouver Sun, and I remember one day above the fold, for those of you who don't read newspapers anymore but just rely on your tablets, that's a significant positioning. It was page 3 above the fold. This was the headline. I read it and thought, why is that news? Don't we all know that women only earn 76 cents on the dollar or whatever it was then? So I read the story wondering what was newsworthy about it, and as it turned out, this headline did not remotely capture the content of the story itself. The story was about the fact that if you had to pay women for the work we perform in the home and in the community that is not monetized, that is not rewarded, it would be worth 40% of the gross domestic product. And I thought, boy, you know, if I'd written the headline, I think I'd have mentioned that. The male headline writer who wrote this headline, and all the headline writers at the Sun at the time were guys, in no way intended to denigrate women's contributions. He had 5 minutes to read the story and assign 7 words that would fit in the available space, and he assigned it based on his reading, his life experience informed perspective on the issue. And so what came up was something very different than I or many of you in this room would have assigned to that story. And that makes a difference in the media context when you think about how significant an impact what appears on our tablets or on the news websites, what's being tweeted about in a dominant way, what's above the fold in the newspaper, that helps to set the public agenda. It determines what we spend money on, what we consider to be important, whose priorities count. And so the absence of women's voices cost us all, because women's life experiences are often profoundly different than men's. Thinking back to my Pope example, a quote that probably wouldn't have been used if I had thought to say it because he had just died, but I still would have educated a couple of reporters who might have done a follow-up story later. And the truth is that when you think about it, most adult women spend decades of our lives either trying to avoid becoming pregnant, trying to become pregnant, or dealing with the consequences of having been pregnant, which last the rest of our lives, and necessarily inflect and influence all sorts of our experiences, how the world treats us, what we view as important, the decisions that we make, the way we respond to medical treatment and drugs, how we're seen by the world. As do other no less significant experiences. The world holds us up to much higher beauty and appearance standards than it does men. We're more fearful in underground parking lots. We're more likely to end up poor. And so the absence of perspectives informed by all those life experiences makes a profound difference to what it is we think about and what decisions we make. So one of the things that I argue and suggest to the now more than 1,000 women that we've trained across the country is that when they are invited to speak and they turn down the opportunity, and they have many good reasons to turn down the opportunity, some of which I've just alluded to, but when that happens, I would argue it's a sad day for not just women everywhere, but all of us. What we notice is that a woman contacted by a journalist will immediately think, well, and often say, you know, I'm not the best person to comment on that. And what we hear from journalists is those words, not the best person, almost never come from men's mouths. And it's not that they all think they're the best person, although a few of them may, no names mentioned. It's just that men, when they're invited to speak, don't immediately go to that place. They think, well, you're calling me because I have 10 years of experience, or I have a relevant title, I teach people this stuff, of course I'll comment. Women, on the other hand, know that they're being held up to a higher standard of authority, that they will be judged differently. And so they're often, in addition to being busier because of the second shift at home, and because they feel still that they need to work twice as hard to be thought half as good, are more protective of their time and less likely to take time out to be interviewed. So that's why we established Informed Opinions to amplify women's voices through the media, to make the case, as I'm doing here, of why it's important to a more productive, stronger, more equitable Canada. We've known for decades, and there's lots been written about the importance of more women in business, in politics, in science, in academia. Media play a critically important role in influencing our perceptions of all of those things, in seeding or in fact thwarting the progress of advancing women's presence in all those arenas, both traditional or legacy newspapers, magazines, television and radio stations, and now increasingly social media, which has the advantage of disseminating and broadening audiences that any or all of us would like to reach, to disseminate knowledge further, to expand people's comprehension of the kinds of issues that SSHRC and NSERC both research. And in fact, on social media, women often have not only more presence, but more capacity to reach out in ways that are sometimes less threatening than legacy media would involve. Unfortunately, the increased visibility afforded by social media also comes with increased vulnerability. How many of you know the story of Anita Sarkeesian? Anybody familiar with this story? So Anita Sarkeesian is a video blogger, and she does a lot of research and work and analysis around the portrayal of women in video games. A couple of years ago, she launched a modest Kickstarter campaign. She was inviting support for a series of videos that she wanted to produce, and for her trouble, because she was challenging the perception of some of the male gamers in the industry and criticizing the sexism of the industry, she got viciously attacked on Facebook, on social media. They created images of her that looked like she'd been beaten to a pulp and posted those. That's the bad news. The good news is that because social media is social media, she was able to respond, and many others came to her defense, and she ended up raising 22 times as much money as she had sought in the first place. So as scary as media can be for women, it's also a forum through which we can mobilize support for work and issues. So since 2010, we've trained, as I mentioned, more than 1,000 expert women, mostly scholars at universities, to say yes to media interviews, to translate their knowledge into accessible commentary. Among the hundreds of published graduates who have both published op-eds and appeared on radio and television station interview shows, these are just 30 odd, and they come from a wide range of disciplines: law, pharmacy, education, environmental studies, economics, engineering. It's really clear that their visibility in the media matters, that their presence helps to counter the fact and mitigate the need we have for more fully clothed female role models. Because as long as these are the most dominant images, it's not that there's an underrepresentation of women in the media across the board. There are actually lots of images of women in the media. It's just that there aren't always a lot of clothing on the women in the media. And so these images, even though they're not serious, they're in pulp culture and entertainment, they still constitute the images against which all women are judged and found wanting. And so even if you're the Secretary of State of the United States, or the Governor General of Canada, or the CEO of a business, or a scientist doing important work, you too can still be judged and found wanting. Many of you are probably familiar with the stereotype, the impact of stereotype threat, the degree to which people reminded of negative stereotypes often perform more poorly on exams as a result of that reminder. The notion that girls aren't good at math or engineering is for boys can exert on girls an effect that makes them less willing to pursue STEM careers, which is why it's so great that NSERC is supporting the chairs in science and engineering for women. The truth is that we're all swimming in a sea of media images and messages that reinforce the entrenched gender bias of our culture in subtle and sophisticated ways. Media are pervasive. They are the psychological water in which we operate, and so that's why women are as likely as men to draw unconscious conclusions about women's capabilities. And so again, you're probably familiar with the related research that sees women and men academics judging more harshly resumes that have a woman's name on them, even if the resume is identical to a previous one that had a male's name on it. It's why orchestras now audition professional musicians blind behind a screen so that they can't see whether or not the musician is male or female, because when this happens, they're more likely to hire more female musicians. This is the comic relief here. This image is in aid of a razor campaign for women, and it's exactly the kind of thing that female scientists are having to still overcome and compete with. The good news is I wrote a couple of media literacy books for kids, and so I used to do a lot of presentations to elementary and high school kids, and when I would throw up this image, even the 7-year-olds would be able to say in response to my question, "What's your first clue that this woman would never make it very far at NASA?" They were all able to point out that she'd been so uncommonly stupid as to remove her helmet while on Mars. And some of them even noted that she looked actually more like a Barbie doll than an actual astronaut. And so having Julie Payette and Roberta Bonder before her, and increasing numbers of women in the sciences, in the professions, in other social sciences, in academia, who are visible and able to counter those images is so profoundly important. Anybody know who this is? Her name is Vigdis Finnbogadóttir. She was for 16 years the president of Iceland. And what that meant was that an entire generation of kids in Iceland grew up only knowing a female head of state. And so when she retired and the local television station was profiling the men who were running to succeed her, her grandson, who was watching television with her, turned to her and said, "But grandmother, they can't be president. They're men." And visible female leadership clearly makes women's capacity for leadership not just conceivable, but in fact inevitable. And so that's why it's so crucial that female scholars and scientists use the media to amplify their voices. It's helpful to have fictional female lawyers and scientists on TV, though the fact that they're invariably glamorous, wearing high heels and lots of makeup, and they're in forensic or courtroom litigators reinforces other stereotypes. But it's not nearly as powerful as seeing actual women on television or in other forms of media. Anybody know who this is? So Emily Grassley works for the Field Museum in Chicago, and she does a regular science vlog, a video blog, where she communicates her vast and infectious enthusiasm for science of all kinds. And she has hundreds of thousands of viewers, and she's doing a great job at making clear to women that science, making clear to everybody that science is exciting, but making clear to women and young girls also that it's something for them. Unfortunately, she too gets pushback. On the episode that you're looking at a clip from, her male colleague is reading out some of the messages, the tweets, the stuff that she gets on social media where she gets judged for her appearance or commented on in terms of her sexuality. Last year, she shared her frustration with that by devoting an episode to those tweets. That kind of pushback is really insidious on girls who are at a stage in their lives when they're trying to make decisions about what direction to go in, what careers to choose. Last year in the New York Times Magazine, there was a big feature called "Who Gets to Graduate?" This is a chemistry class at the University of Texas, and it talked in the article about fascinating research into the kinds of interventions that make a difference to students who are more statistically likely to drop out, not just women, but ethnic minorities, Aboriginal people, people with disabilities. And the answer was pretty clear, or at least one of them was, and that is that when young women and those in other groups receive the message, you belong here, you have a contribution to make, you're capable, others like you felt similarly alienated, but you belong here. That's ultimately what makes the difference. And so the work that NSERC is doing in funding chairs and the visibility of, in this case, I think these were from Catherine Mavriplis' site, hundreds of women in the aerospace industry. The internet makes it easier for us to disseminate and share messages and profiles of women who are in the media, because this is not ultimately a woman's issue. Innovation, technological advance, productivity, competitiveness, all of those are dependent on a broader talent pool, and being not only reminded that it's important that women belong and speak up, but knowing where to find them is critical for all of us. There is a growing body of research literature. Again, many of you are probably familiar with the extent to which business research has found that when women are included in around board tables and in the C-suite, the results include increased profits and revenues, better work-life policies, which leads to better retention, improved customer relations. And in science, gender-balanced teams often come up with better research. Women are apparently more inclined in collaborative research to minimize risk, and men are more inclined to maximize gain. And faced with unexpected findings, some research has found that women tend to probe for the reasons behind the unexpected findings, while men's bias is to change the methodology or strategy. And the point is that these are really complementary tendencies, and the research that comes out of mixed gender scientific teams is better. These are just a few of the innovations that women were behind. And you can see how our different life experiences may have informed many, if not all of these. Hundreds of the women that have trained through Informed Opinions workshops have now written and published op-eds, newspaper commentary in daily newspapers, national newspapers across the country. These are just a few of the headlines attached to the comments that they made, the issues that they drew attention to. And they cross as many disciplines and diverse perspectives as there are. And these op-eds are helping us to answer the question, what difference does it make when women's voices are present? Because since the beginning of the project, it's been difficult for us to say, well, to measure an absence. If the women's voices aren't there, it's very difficult to predict what impact they would have if they were there. So finally, after we had 100 op-eds on our site that had been written by the women we trained, we created a word cloud. We conducted a little experiment of our own. We created a word cloud from those 100 commentaries to see what issues came up most often. This is that word cloud. We then, for comparative purposes, took 100 commentaries written by men in the same papers at the same time and created a comparable word cloud and deducted all of those that were similar or that were in the same words from each word cloud to see which words would not have appeared prominently in the op-eds written by men. I'm just going to read you a few of those words that only appeared prominently in women's commentary. Access, assault, benefit, care, children, cuts, discrimination, education, equality, families, future, girls, help, justice, school, services, sexual, society, students, support, treatment, violence, women. So when women are not commenting, those words don't get as much attention. Those issues don't get as much attention. And even though the women writing the op-eds were writing on a wide variety of issues, they weren't all writing about sexual violence. Those were issues that came up much more frequently. A century ago, British author Virginia Woolf famously said, "For most of history, Anonymous has been a woman." hence the title of my talk. There were reasons for that, circumstances that kept us enslaved or subservient, unable to speak or to be heard. We didn't have a room of our own. But now increasingly we do. And as a result, Antonia Maione and Constance Backhouse write op-eds and do TV interviews. And when Shirk and NSERC reward and give profile to scholars like Tamara Franz Odendahl and Wei-Ling Yi, it's enormously powerful. So in every workshop that we deliver, we remind the women that we work with that you are among the most privileged women in the world. You're educated, you're affluent, you're employed, you have a title and an affiliation. And so if you don't speak up, who will? Over the past century, women have, of course, made enormous gains in women's rights and opportunities. But beneficent governments didn't just bestow those gains on us. It required women to speak up, to be visible, to be heard, to get sexual assault laws, maternity leave, to get the vote. And so change happens when people do speak up, and that goes for scholars and scientists, not just women, but men as well. Here's what the late Steve Snyder said of Stanford to his colleagues about that. Not sharing your knowledge if you have insight into an issue that is profound, that has significant implications, not sharing your knowledge is shirking your obligation. And on the upside, the benefits and advantages, some of which we're going to hear from our panel in a minute, are also significant. Sarah Foster is not a tenure-track professor. She's a research associate at UBC, and this is what she had to say about the impact of the first commentary that she wrote. She's since, given her incentive, done others. American author Alice Walker once said that the most common way people give up power is by believing they don't have any. This goes for government scientists and funding agencies too. I understand that the policy environment is difficult and that people are cautious about what they think they can say and where and when, but we all have much more power than we think. Thank you. Merci.